Nausea, sea foam that bled upward from warped and blackened wood. A taste like copper in his mouth. Simon rose to his feet and spit blood into his palm, wiped it on his pants, and fumbled his way through the mass of huddled bodies. The air smelled of piss and echoed with crying children. His legs, made weak from maintaining balance at sea, ached with the pain of too many nights spent sleeping on wooden floorboards. It had been 3 weeks since the sun had risen. The smell of the ocean hit him before he reached the top deck, felt its sickly salt tongue worm its way through his nostrils and fill his stomach, felt the cold, wet wind splatter against his face. All along the deck, he watched the men work, tightening ropes, cleaning and polishing wood, their faces orange with lantern light. It would be time for morning prayer soon, Simon thought to himself. He could tell by the subtle shift in the brightness of the lanterns. Their oil, nearly exhausted completely, told him he had been asleep for 5 hours. He stumbled past the crew and threw his head over the starboard bulwark, passively observing the vomit flow from his mouth and into the darkness below. Raising his head, he looked out into the black, searching for the dim lights of the Sovereign and the Fortune, feeling a numb relief when he saw the lanterns of one and ice in his stomach when he could not detect the other. They had left England with 5 ships, 3 merchant vessels built to haul cargo across the Caribbean, now loaded to the brim with human beings, and 2 of the king's finest galleons, military ships with more cannons than people, bright white sails that danced in the ocean breeze. He had not seen those sails for weeks. He wiped the vomit from his lip and massaged the branded T on his palm. The New World was not an uncomfortable idea to him. He did not care for God in the same way as his fellow pilgrims, though he did share with them a desire for escape. He had grown up surrounded by walls and covered in filth. He had known the pain of an empty stomach since before he could walk, and as he quickly learned, hunger grows thieves faster than rain grows crops. The first time he was caught, he was publicly flogged. 50 lashes with a cat o' nine tails. He remembers the warmth of the blood that flowed down his back, and he remembers the fever heat of the infection to follow. The weeks spent in bed, unable to move, unable to speak, shallow breaths lest the wounds tear. He had stolen a roll of bread. He was 14 years old. The second time he was caught would be the final time. He was flogged again and jailed. The years had added girth to his frame, and the spider web scars had dulled the pain and lessened the blood flow, though flow it did. Infection did not follow this time, though he was assured that the hangman would. For days he sat, bleeding in a rat-infested gaol until his jailer came to him and informed him that his sentence would be commuted from hanging to transportation. He was beaten, branded as a thief with a hot iron, and handed over to the merchant shipping company. 10 years of indentured servitude. He tried not to think about what the years would do to him, and instead focused on what he would do with his freedom once he acquired it. His thoughts were broken by a bell from above, the sound of scrambling footsteps and the whispers of colonists. He saw Father Geoffrey in his white-collared cassock, thick leather Bible tucked under his arm, calling the crew to prayer. Geoffrey was a tall man, his voice a low baritone that filled you up. Eyes like ice and smoke, skin wrinkled and blackened by the sun. Only there was no sun now, and every day the sun did not rise, his voice carried less weight. In the 5th week of travel, just as the sun had begun to set for the final time, and the hordes of weeping bodies came floating past the ship, it was Father Geoffrey that warned us against helping them. From the twilight horizon they came, naked and moaning, clinging to each other and calling out to us, screaming for help. Hundreds of men and women, pale and bloated bodies choked by sea foam and blistered by the sun. It was the starling that first attempted a rescue, setting down ropes into the ocean that the floating bodies could cling to, could climb up the wooden frame and make their way aboard. Simon didn't know what happened when the bodies reached the top deck, but he remembered the screams, watched the pale hull metastasize into a sickly yellow-brown hue, saw the fleshy film coat the sails and smother the crew, and he listened to the weeping bodies in the water turn to a high-pitched chittering laughter. Again the bell called out from overhead, and Simon followed the crowd, quickly gathering around Father Geoffrey. Simon took no comfort in morning prayer, though for one such as him, a known thief, it was best to avoid the attention. And so he followed. He kneeled with the others surrounding Geoffrey, who stood tall atop the ship's broad capstan, followed along as they said grace and listened to the morning sermon. "My children," he began, "our prayers these last few weeks have not gone unheard, for it is written in the Gospel of Matthew, 'When two or more are gathered in the name of Christ, there he too is among them.'" He clutched his fist as he said this, knuckles white, raised to the starless void above. "And did not Moses cause darkness to spread over Egypt? A darkness that could be felt, a darkness suffered by not only Pharaoh and his pagan priests, but by the holy people of Israel. So too does the Lord test us on this day. Just as he released his plagues on the evildoers, so too did his wrath touch those righteous few, not out of malice, but that they may be tested, that their resolve may be strengthened." He cleared his throat and looked out over his congregation. "Did not Job suffer in his abandonment? Did not the apostles suffer torment for their faith? Did Christ himself not starve in the wilderness, tempted by Satan that he may fulfill his holy mission?" There were grumbles from the crowd, vague emotions of disapproval, just subtle enough to translate their disdain without gaining the ire of the officials. "So too do we suffer," he continued. "Our children vanish as we sleep. Every day we are plagued by nightmares that scream and follow us into our waking days. Our food and supplies grow mouths and tongues and mock us until they are cast overboard. And yet our resolve remains strong. Our faith remains unwavering." The grumbling from the crowd grew louder, and Geoffrey raised his arm to silence them. "And now it has come to pass that our resolve must be tested again," he said, eyes growing dark. "Hours ago, the Fortune weighed anchor without signal and sailed into the coastline. Its lanterns went dark, and we have not heard nor seen anything since." Uproar, shouts, and panicked weeping. Some of the more bold men surged forward, only to be dragged away by soldiers. Simon shoved back against the mass of arms and tattered clothing, but found himself swept up in the frenzy. "Peace!" Father Geoffrey shouted. Leathery hands turned outward. Soldiers began to corral the crowd, bayonets pointed at the desperate wall of men. Commands shouted, the loading of rifles. One soldier thrusted the butt of his gun to the stomach of a bearded man, and he dropped to the ground with a thud. This seemed to settle the worst of it, and finally, Geoffrey's voice could be heard over the chaos. "Peace, brothers and sisters. Be calm," he shouted, voice hoarse, rusted, forehead dotted and smeared with sweat. "The situation," bellowed Geoffrey, "will be investigated. The captain has requested volunteers." A voice from the crowd cuts him off. "They send us to do the jobs of soldiers now," shouted a woman from behind Simon. "I assure you," said Father Geoffrey, "volunteers will be armed, provisioned, and rewarded handsomely." A pause. The crowd went silent. Geoffrey continued. "Should we be granted the grace of God and safely reach the New World, your name will be among the first in the allotment. And to any among you bound by indenture, know this: your service shall be acquitted, and your bonds will be amended." Simon's shoulders tensed. He chewed his lip and hesitated, even as the men began to raise their arms and volunteer, even as they were one by one escorted below deck to be outfitted for the task. He felt the cold wind carve through his thin linen shirt, felt it on the spiderweb scar tissue that coated his back, and then he too raised his hand. Simon stumbled. He attempted to hold his balance at the tip of the longboat, digging his boots into the splintered wooden underside, holding tight to the frayed rope support, feeling it chafe and burn his hands as the men were lowered slowly into the ocean. He had nearly lost his balance when a man twice his height grabbed him by the shirt and stabilized him, thick-fingered hands latching onto the ropes to steady the swaying vessel. Simon had seen the man before, an older man with wild, graying beard and a limp in his left leg. He did not travel with a family, at least none that Simon had seen. And every morning, Simon would see him on the top deck, pacing around and around the length of the ship, arms behind his back, lost in thought. He had thought him to be a frail old man, but now saw the muscles throbbing beneath his shirt, saw the confidence with which he stood, and the quickness with which he moved. The boat kissed the ocean, and Simon took his position at its head, watched the rope slither up the ship's wooden hull, and held tight as the men pushed away with their oars. There were 10 besides himself and the bearded man, faces pale, clothes baggy and torn. It had been 2 days since Simon had eaten, and he wondered how long it had been since they had had a proper meal for themselves. If they even had the strength to row the boat to shore in their condition. The sea had calmed somewhat, he noticed. Waves that had once threatened to capsize now gently guided them along to the slap beat of oar row. Long black tongues of water that lapped hungrily at the sides of the boat. Slow, tender, almost loving. He picked up the mirror lantern and angled it outwards, tried holding it high above his head, but the light only trickled against the inky waters, flickering golden cone given form by the thickness of the fog, as if unable to cut through shadow. He looked back at the ship, trying to orient himself, ship lights dimming and twinkling until he had to squint to see them at all. He thought about how easy it would be to lose himself, how simply the fog could swallow him whole and leave him and the other men adrift in the cold and the dark. He had heard the stories, of course, of men separated from their ship, adrift at sea. The soldiers had been gracious enough to outfit him. With a pistol and a single shot, and he considered how many days he would last before he would use it, how he would use it. Silence from all around. A gentle breeze against Simon's face. Cold and sharp on his fingers. The soft rhythmic sound of oars against water. A vague pull in Simon's gut. He knew their course could only be forward, but there was a slant to it, a misshape in gravity. He tried readjusting his stance, but the world felt tilted, unstable. He clutched his lantern and waited. A man near the back began to pray. And then Simon was thrown forward. The beach had snuck up on them, announcing itself only with the sudden scrape of wood and sand and the thrusting forward of Simon's weight. He heard gasps from behind him, shocked groans, and then the crash of the ocean around his head. Tasted the salt water in his mouth and felt the burn in his eyes. He inhaled sharply, shock gasp pulling a gulp of brine into his stomach and lungs, and then the burn was inside of him, bubbling around him as it spewed forward from his mouth. And then the tide pulled back from above. The weight of his water-soaked clothes was immediately upon him. Hands half buried in sand, seashells digging into his skin. A firm hand gripped his back and lifted him, and there once again was the bearded man, slapping him on the back until the foamy bile finished flowing from his mouth. Thankfully, his lantern had not followed him, though it had to be relit and its mirrors readjusted. The light once returned, revealed them to be standing on a rocky shoreline. No trees, no vegetation of any kind as far as the light would show. Unable to see the fortune from their position, it was decided that the men would follow the shoreline to the east for 100 paces, and then, if nothing could be found, they would walk west for 200 paces, and so on. And so, Simon, being the only man among them with a source of light, led the men across the beach, steps heavy and sloshing against the tide in the sand. A voice from behind. The bearded man. "These be my first steps on foreign soil, Christ save me," he said. He was older than Simon had originally placed him, all baggy wrinkled eyes and liver spots that smeared his skin and dotted his cheeks, a tuft of thin, wild hair atop his head, pale, spider-like hand brought up to his face to stave off the wind. "It is strange," replied Simon. "The sand here, it's like it's pulling you down." The man stared into the darkness. "You've had the dreams, then?" "Some," Simon replied. No sense to him, like some of the others say. More feelings than dreams. Sights, smells, sweat and teeth, that sort. "And yourself?" The bearded man paused. He coughed and spat into the sand. Eyes forward, steps careful and deliberate. "Younger days. As a boy, I was a sailor. Ran cargo from Plymouth to Newcastle." "And what was your cargo?" "Human beings." Simon gritted his teeth. The man chortled to himself. "I see your hate at my profession," he said. "Don't blame me none. Evil work it was, but the sin of a man's youth is between him and the Almighty, eh?" "Aye, I suppose so," said Simon. "There were 2 ships. Always 2, he went on. One to bear the wretched souls, other to guard 'em safe to port. I served the latter, mark ye. Never laid eyes on that sorry cargo, nay, but them slavers' hulks, they carried a stench, God's truth. Foul as a midden heap, borne on the wind." The man once again coughed and spat. "I was working the ropes, as is my wont, when the air turns ranker still, like to scorch the throat. Shouts rise all about, and I look and I sees it. The slave ship's aflame. One of them poor devils broke free, set ablaze, I reckon. Chose the fire to the chains." Simon looked at him. "That's what be in me dreams, boy. The stink of it. The shape of those poor devils aflame and leaping from the bow." "Can't say I blame them none. Braver men than I," said Simon. The man laughed. "Aye, that they were, that they were." At this, Simon grew silent, only the crunch of sand beneath them to mark their pace. He wondered how far they had walked. He had lost count some time ago, and can feel the fatigue weighing on his legs. Felt the sweat bubbling in his underarms. Should they turn around? Perhaps one of the others had kept count and was about to speak up. But Simon did not have time to consider the answer to this, because somewhere, outside the reach of the fading mirror lantern, he heard footsteps. The ship itself seemed to be turned over on its side, as if it had drifted too close to shore and gotten caught on the beach before being knocked over by the rising tide. He saw barrels and ropes turned over, but still clinging to the deck as if to disobey gravity entirely. One of the men knocked his fist against it, and it rang out hollow and thin. And then, from above, the footsteps returned. Simon lurched back. The lantern fell to the sand, and he felt himself tumbling over, scrambling, hands digging into the coarse, wet sand. A panicked shout from one of the men. Another bolted into the darkness, cursing himself. Simon fumbled for his pistol and raised it in front of him, the lantern casting its glow onto the hulking side of the Fortune. A shape, a movement just out of lantern's reach, a pair of hands extended from the darkness into the light from above. Fingers, pale and unmoving, dangling down from the very top of the cone of light, followed by the leathery backside of a man's head. slithering downward until it plopped itself on the sand. Simon felt sweat beading on his forehead. The form extended itself. First its arms, bent backwards and spread open wide, reaching. And then its head, inflating itself, like a wet rag swelling until it was full, until it was standing, mouth twisted open into a wide smile. Simon stared into its eyes and could see that the form was hollow, a shell of skin emptied of flesh. It was naked, all wet hair and sagging muscles, genitals flat against its thigh. It bowed and extended an open hand. Simon bit his tongue until he tasted blood. For a moment, Simon forgot about the pistol in his hand. And then the figure lunged. The firing pin clamped down and let out a wet click. There was a smell like rotted breath, a taste like wood and bile, and beneath it was something else. Something that gnawed, that twisted. The figure stretched open its mouth, and Simon could see shapes moving inside. Images, like paintings, yet moving. A woman slitting her own wrists before a crowd of onlookers. A man falling from the parapets of a grand cathedral. A child starving to death on a bed of flowers. And then the bearded man was between them. The creature had the old man almost completely enveloped in moments, even as he charged and slammed his weight into it, even as the pair fell, writhing into the sand. It spread over him, over his mouth and his eyes, and Simon could hear his muffled screams turn slowly into laughter, into music. Simon pulled back the firing pin, and again he squeezed the trigger. There was a flash, and the thunder pop of damp gunpowder, a splatter of scarlet against the ship hull behind them. The creature made no noise as it fell, but inside, Simon could hear the old man cry out in pain and let out a long, rusted groan. The creature began to shake violently, displacing sand from around it until it had submerged itself, until the beach went still atop it. And then, silence. Pins and needles in his hand from the recoil. He forced himself to breathe and looked around. Nobody. The men had fled. He could only guess as to where. Perhaps they ran further inland, or leaped into the ocean in hopes they could swim back to the ship. For a moment, he too tried to run, but found his legs would not move. Another breath. He let the pistol fall to the ground. He thought to himself, would they go for the longboat? Would he be abandoned? They had no light, and he considered whether or not they would even be capable of finding the longboat in the darkness when his thoughts were interrupted by a sound from above him. He plucked the lantern from the sand and angled it upwards, up towards the tilted sails and the groaning wood. Hundreds of naked bodies stared back down at him, flaps of skin fluttering in the wind. Simon no longer needed eyes to find the ship. He did not need the longboat to reach it. The voice from within his stomach guided him over the waves, steps gentle, the ocean water cool on the flats of his feet. He allowed the song to fill him, let it pour out from his lungs and fill the air until it was the air, until his dance swept him up and dragged him along, until he was standing barefoot on the hardwood deck among the gasps and the screams. He held no hate in his soul for them, not even Father Geoffrey, who grabbed him by the shirt and struck him upon the head. Geoffrey, like the others, had simply yet to find his song, had yet to hear it in his breast and dance to its tender beat. And when Simon had Geoffrey's tongue in hand, and Geoffrey lay gurgling and twitching below him, Simon needed only allow the tongue to sing. In moments, it had sung the sun from the horizon, glittering in the sky with hues of gold and blue, and Simon, even with no eyes to see, even with no skin to feel the warmth of noon, danced in joy at the blessing of Joffrey's song. And Joffrey went still, and the sails were lowered, and the ship was on its way back to England. There was a part of Simon that wished to remain, a part of him that was very quickly suffocating. The freedom he had found in the New World was not of a kind that he had expected, but it was of a kind that he knew needed to be shared. He thought of burning slave ships and starving street urchins. He thought of kings and of Christ and of tall cathedral peaks, and he knew that to deprive the world of this gift would be a betrayal of his own soul. And it was to this song that he danced, and it was to this song that tumors grew on the walls of the Tower of London.